presentation. There's a couple of polls that I wanted to conduct, and if you can just hold on a minute, I'm going to launch this one poll. If you just take a minute to answer the poll question. Okay, we'll just give another couple of seconds to get as many responses as possible. Okay, we're going to close this down. And I'm just going to show you the responses. We have about 8% that are in Tier 1, 31% that would be Tier 2, 27% state DOT, about a quarter of the folks are not really sure, and then about 8% are not applicable. Okay, I'm just going to hide this and then do one more poll, so bear with me. Okay, if you can answer this question, that'd be great. And I realize that most of the folks that are answering this are state DOTs, so may not be applicable to some others. And I would say we probably hit the people, so I'm closing it down. As you can see, 53% are developing a group transit asset management plan for Tier 2 recipients. 8% have their Tier 2 or their subrecipients doing their own plan, 14% a combination, and then about a quarter of that have not made a decision yet on how they're going to do the transit asset management plan. Okay, hide this, and we are all done with our polling, and I'm just going to advance the slide once and introduce you to Sean Kelly. He's the Senior Associate at RLS Associates. Kelly Sean joined RLS and Associates in 2013 to enhance RLS's safety and security, compliance, and service operations division. He brings 30 years of experience in the transportation industry, most recently with the Community Transportation Association of America, or CTAA, where he worked with the rural and tribal technical assistance programs. Prior to 18 years with CTAA, Mr. Sean worked in the management and operations positions with the Washington Area Metropolitan Transit Authority and intercity bus companies. Kelly Sean.
Thank you, Rob, or Tassinary Rob.
Yeah, Kelly, I'm sorry. You know,
It's happened all my life. No worries.
Can't imagine it happening all your life. Okay, Kelly, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar to discuss transit asset management. Transit asset management is something that has been brewing for a while originally, and you can go to the next slide. Originally coming out in MAP 21, and then further driven home with the latest reauthorization. Transit asset management is something that FTA as well as DOT and Congress have decided is something that needs to be established so that they have an idea of what the transit needs are for infrastructure, vehicles, facilities, rail. Many events of the last couple of years have really pointed to the need for this, especially here in the Washington, D.C. area. We've faced a lot of that through experiences with WMATA here in D.C. With transit asset management coming out in MAP 21, it was identified here recently, and actually just updated last week, that $89.8 billion in backlogs for state of good repair. So that's a huge amount. Now, after tomorrow, we'll see if that gets any more attention than it has in the past. We don't know. But basically, FTA has come up with the figures from NTD data and data that they've collected over the past few years from MAP 21 with a lot of the urban systems and small urban systems and MPOs, and identified that $1.5 billion is needed annually just to keep the backlog from growing, so that doesn't even take care of trying to reduce the backlog. And as I mentioned, the recently completed conditions and performance report just came out last week, so these numbers are fresh off the boat. Next slide, please. So currently, the final rule that came out in July, on July 26th, 49 CFR Part 625, which also included 49 CFR Part 630, which focused on National Transit Database. The rule for 625 will be effective on October 1st, 2016, with a 2-year implementation period. So by 2018, October 1st, all systems will need to have a valid and defined transit asset management plan in place. Now, FTA is looking to have components of that plan in place before October of 18, and has just recently, as of today, sent out a reminder about information that states and subrecipients are looking to provide on targets and performance measures for assets. So who does this apply to? Well, it applies to anyone who receives funding under 49 U.S.C. 53 that own, operate, or manage capital assets used for providing public transportation. And the key to that is public transportation. Some of the groups that I guess luckily were left out of it in their minds, some of the 5310s who provide closed-door transportation services would not be included in transit asset management plan unless their vehicles are used in any way for public transportation. One of the factors of the rule and the way it was designed and the many templates and tools that FTA has provided is that it will be scalable for small and large systems. One of the challenges for FTA anytime they develop a rule, whether it's drug and alcohol or safety and security or whatever, is trying to make it to where it can be implemented no matter what the size of the system is. This rule, for the most part, does that. It will have an impact on all systems, small and large. There will be additional data requirements, which we'll go into later on in the presentation. But FTA has also provided a plethora of technical assistance tools and guidelines and tools on their website. If you go to their website and search Transit Asset Management, they've got several documents, including a document for developing transit asset management plan for small systems, which is very helpful. It gives you an Excel spreadsheet template to use to help you develop your transit asset management plan. But there's a lot of good information out there, and I would suggest that if you haven't already, please take a look at the FTA's website and look at some of the tools they've developed. Okay, next slide. So the plan is, the intention of the plan was to help transit system assess what their current condition of all capital assets meaning facilities, rolling stock, infrastructure and rail structures if you have rail, as well as equipment. Equipment's kind of a broad term, and sorry, my screen blanked for a second. But equipment usually covers maintenance type equipment, and we'll go into more details in later slides. But what they're trying to do is determine the condition and the performance of assets, and identify assets that are not in a state of good repair. And again, later on we'll define what is state of good repair. It's an innocuous term that everybody hears, but a lot of people don't know exactly what is meant by state of good repair. And then identifying unacceptable risks, including safety, and continuing to use the asset that, if not in a state of good repair. I have managed transit systems before, and I know that there are times where we may send out vehicles that might not be the best suited vehicle to be in service, and that happens out of necessity, out of the needs of the clients. With this rule, as well as safety and security compliance that will be coming out, at least for transit system plans, it's meant to provide an understanding of what equipment out there is suitable to provide rides with, what equipment is safe to be used for the riding public, for our employees. So that's kind of what this whole transit asset management plan is meant to do, is to identify deficiencies in your service area or your capital assets. It's also used as a planning tool. How do we identify these vehicles that we probably have gotten all we can get out of them? How do we work on replacing those? How do we prioritize what needs to be replaced? This is always a challenge, and one of the big factors involved in that is, well, how much funding is the state going to provide us for replacing vehicles? Or is the state replacing vehicles this year or doing new startups? So there's a lot of local decision making that has to take place based on your environmental factors, funding, service, future service plans that you might have. You might be starting a new service. What type of vehicles do you need for that? Can we use our existing vehicles? So the TAM plan will help you to balance and prioritize reasonably anticipated funding levels, revenues from all sources, and not just FTA funds, but some of you may be using other funds to help diversify your funding for capital assets. But the performance and condition is what FTA is really looking at. The performance measures that will need to be put in place for transit asset management are a similar structure as the safety and security that will be coming out very soon. It came out in MAP 21, but it's also going to be expanded with more definition from FTA in the near future. But FTA is looking to see performance standards, performance measures, and for transit asset management targets, performance targets. So, and we'll go into those in the next couple of slides. Next slide. Okay, so the transit asset management program is divided into two structures. The first structure is Tier 1, which are larger systems that either operate rail or they have more than 101 revenue vehicles operating in public transit service. So that does not include maintenance vehicles or support vehicles. Tier 2 definition is you own, operate, or manage 100 or fewer revenue vehicles, or you're a subrecipient under 5311 or an American Indian tribe, and you have no rail or fixed guideway. Okay, so it's a pretty clear definition, and under those definitions, Tier 2 can include rural and tribal transit systems, as well as small urban transit systems that don't operate rail or fixed guideway. So it's a Tier 2 is a pretty big pot of transit providers. Next slide. So under Tier 1, and I know from the intro poll that not a lot of you fall into this, but some of the categories that Tier 1 transit systems will be providing is inventory, number and type of capital assets, which Tier 2 will as well. Condition report of those assets, and then a description of the analytical process or how they make decisions on replacement, on refurbishing or retooling their vehicles and replacement. Also project-based prioritization of investments. So we have the money to replace that one vehicle after it's reached its useful life, and how do you plan to do the replacement? What are your priorities? How do you define priority? Transit asset management and state of good repair policy, each system must have that. Transit asset management implementation strategy, which is different from the Tier 2s. And then description of key transit asset management activities. So as you can see, there's a considerable amount of work for a lot of the large urban and rail providers. Summary or list of resources including personnel to carry out the TAM. So each action item under the Transit Asset Management Plan would require identification of staff who will be responsible for that, benchmarks, deadlines, and things like that. And then outline of monitoring, update, and evaluation of TAM. Just that line right there, outline of monitoring, update, and evaluation of TAM. That also carries forward in the safety and security arena as well. So you're going to be seeing some of that when that comes out, but just thought I'd make a note of that. Tier 2, next slide. Okay, so Tier 2, as you can see, a little bit less requirements for Tier 2s. Like Tier 1, inventory, number, and type of capital assets need to be identified, along with a condition report of those assets. And we will get into condition reports in the next slides. Description of analytical process or decision-making tools. One of the things, this is an interesting point here as FTA is looking to see how did you decide that you want to replace these 3 vehicles? What's your process? So you need to come up with some definition of how you do your vehicle replacements or how you refurbish a vehicle. And currently there may be a couple of decision-making tools out there. I haven't seen them yet, but that's something that you should give consideration to of when to replace vehicles, whether it's, well, they've met their useful life, mileage, and conditions poor, or they have exceeded their useful life by 100% and it's a maintenance nightmare. In other cases, you may have a lemon vehicle where you're repairing it constantly even though it's not that old. It doesn't have that many miles. So all of that needs to be built into your decision-making process. And then last is the project-based prioritization of investments. How do you plan to cover the cost of replacement? What funding are you going to use to cover the cost? What is the time frame of investment in new vehicles or replacement vehicles? Tier 2 providers may be part of a group plan with a sponsor, mainly the state. And we've talked about in the poll, there are several states here. I think 24 maybe. Anyways, a lot of the states are going the route of developing a state-sponsored plan and gathering data from all their 5311 recipients, and in some cases some 5307 recipients, to develop a statewide plan that will incorporate performance measures, performance targets, replacement strategies, prioritizing strategies, and monitoring of capital assets. By doing this provides a consistent method across the board throughout the state. It also puts a little more reliance on the state DOTs to administer and manage the program, but also to keep up with it, maintain it, and monitor it. Several states right now have a system in place where they're monitoring capital assets. Some are fairly basic with quarterly reporting on the status of every capital asset being used for public transportation. Others go a little bit more intense and have a web-based program where transit systems upload their maintenance documents anytime a vehicle's had an oil change, to annual inspection results, to mileage, monthly mileage. So states all are on different levels of the type of data they collect. Next slide. So, state of good repair. Some of the aspects of a state of good repair is the Transit Asset Management Plan helps to identify safety risks through asset management in determining state of good repair of an asset and mitigation strategies. So if you've identified capital assets, whether it's vehicles, facilities, equipment, that are not in a state of good repair, there needs to be a process in which you bring it into a state of good repair, whether that means rebuilding the transmission or replacing the vehicle or turning it into a service vehicle, or there has to be some kind of a strategy once you've identified that it's not in a state of good repair. Both TAM and safety management systems from the Safety and Security require a designated accountable executive responsible for ensuring funding and culture in place to support both. I had mentioned also that under Safety and Security there will be performance measures that have to be in place. So these are things just to keep an eye out for once the SMS for transit system plans has been finalized. And then performance measures with both. Okay, next slide. So Tier 2, where do we start? So much stuff that Kelly's throwing at us. How do we organize all this? My first suggestion is to start with your data collection methods. How are you identifying what's being done to the vehicle? I'm sure it's getting oil changes on an incremental basis. But are you tracking the mileage? Are you rating the condition? Does the state send somebody out annually to do an inspection of all your vehicles and do a condition report of each of the vehicles? These are things that you'll have to be doing, is collecting this data, and we'll go over the data you need to collect in the next couple slides. Organization of data and asset-related policies. So your preventive maintenance program for vehicles, facilities, equipment, vehicle disposition plans that are probably passed on to you from the state, and then monitoring of your capital assets. And monitoring could include, we have OSHA come in annually and do an inspection of our transit facility. The state DOT comes in and does inspections of our transfer center or our vehicles. Our drivers every day do an inspection of our vehicles and submit a vehicle inspection report. These are all aspects of preventive maintenance, of asset management that would be included in your plan. Also development of goals and performance measures, and I'm sure many of you have performance measures in place. Some of the performance measures might include something like what's our breakdown ratio to 100,000 miles traveled, or how many times did we have a vehicle towed back to the shop due to a maintenance issue. Other goals might be how many times what was our on-time performance, and was maintenance a factor in our on-time performance. Or you might look at our vehicles. Currently we operate minivans, and all of them, or a majority of them, are 6 to 8 years old. So 4-year rated vehicles are 6 to 8 years old. A goal might be we're going to get that down to an average of 6 years old, down from 7.5. Whatever your goals and performance measures are, it's going to be based on what your data is, where you are right now, and they have to be achievable. So something reasonable and quantifiable. And then need to look at your investment and replacement strategies. So that what impacts that is the state procurement. If you buy vehicles off the state bid, how quickly do those vehicles turn around? What's your match requirement? What's the state's thought on replacement of vehicles? So all those play a role. Next slide. Okay, so these are the asset categories, and this is pretty much taken from an FTA document, at least the asset categories. And this is for Tier 2, so you'll have 3 areas: rolling stock, facility, and equipment that you'll need to be monitoring and report on. Some of you may not have facilities. You may lease a facility from county government, or you may just be parking your vehicles at the park and rec parking lot, or whatever. But facilities you may not have any FTA investment in, so you might not be reporting on that. But all your vehicles that have FTA investment or are also operating in public transit would need to be recorded and documented. And as you can see in this chart, we've got the asset category, and then underneath that the asset class. And I just kind of made these up: bus, medium bus, van, car. And then you've got an asset subclass for each of those 3. Because van, car might include 15-passenger van, minivan, and sedan. But each of those asset subclasses, you would need to have performance measures and targets for each of those. So this is why you do a chart like that, so you get a bearing on what you have, because a 12-year bus is going to have different performance targets, different useful lives than a minivan with a 4-year useful life. So that has to be taken into account. Equipment divided into 2 asset classes: maintenance and then non-revenue vehicles. As you can see, maintenance might be a lift system, bus wash system, any kind of system that is not a part of the facility or that can be removed or added to a facility that has a value of greater than $50,000. And that's same with non-revenue vehicles. Has a purchase value of greater than $50,000. So a pickup truck that you use for road calls that's under $50,000, you would not need to report. Okay, next slide. How do I classify my vehicles? Well, FTA has done that already for you. You can use what they've got in the circular 5010-.1D. This kind of gives you an idea how you can put your vehicles into categories. This not only gives the length of the vehicle, but it also gives gross vehicle weight, which may help you. A lot of states have already classified your vehicles into light duty, mid-size, heavy duty, small bus. So look to your states, especially those of you that are procuring vehicles from the state. There may already be minimal service life categories for the vehicles you have. Next slide. Okay, factors going into defining the state of good repair. One, useful life benchmark, which is the most common factor in user defined. Useful life, like we saw on the last slide, you may have a vehicle that's rated for 4 years of useful life. Does this mean that at 5 years you have to replace it? No. The FTA also has on their website a listing of minimal useful life, which you can check as well, which is something that may be helpful in defining your categories and of your capital assets. Useful mileage benchmark, so that's based on mileage for the vehicle. As you saw in the last slide, each of those categorized vehicles had a year for useful life as well as useful life mileage. Again, it's just a template. You all will come up with what you decide as your benchmarks are. And then condition assessment, a rating scale of the vehicle condition, maintenance, and safety. This is one of the tougher things to do, especially if you've got an outside shop that may be doing an assessment, or you've got multiple facilities, you operate in 4 counties, you have 3 garages, and 3 different people are doing condition assessments. So you have to make sure that they're all doing it the same way and using the same format. Condition assessments can be simple, or they can be a little bit more detailed. It's up to you, but there has to be some method in place to defining what the condition of each capital asset is. And that includes facilities and equipment as well. Next slide. Okay, so, and we'll move through these somewhat quickly. Defining state of good repair based on useful life benchmarks. Useful life is user-defined. Like I mentioned, they try to keep it flexible so that you can define it on operating environment, historical evidence, manufacturer guidelines, and other relevant factors. For instance, if you've got one system that operates a 4-year-old vehicle, let's just say a minivan, and only runs it 4 hours a day, compared to a system B that has a minivan that operates 20 hours a day service, or a service that's running 4 hours, but all that's highway miles. These are environmental conditions that have to be a part of how you define useful life. Because obviously system A is not going to meet the mileage factor. They may meet the year factor, but mileage is going to be far different than the vehicle that's operated 20 hours a day. So take that into account. It has to be relative to your type of operation, as well as conditions. Vehicles operated in Bethel, Alaska may have a shorter useful life and very low miles compared to other systems in Florida that may be operating 20 hours a day in heat or medium climates in the middle of the country. So just take it into account. There must be a rationale behind useful life definitions, not necessarily tied to funding cycles. So in other words, if you know that the state's not going to provide you a replacement vehicle for 6 years for your 4-year vehicle, you shouldn't just pick 6 years as my useful life because I know the state will replace it in 6 years. It needs to be more systematic and better defined than just including funding, though funding is crucial. But you need to look at all aspects of it and how you use the vehicle. can be used in defining performance targets, life cycle costs, and maintenance structure. So useful life benchmarks, when you're developing life cycle costs, for instance, you're going to realize that the first couple of years, maintenance costs are going to be basic, oil changes, basic inspections. But as the vehicle gets older and closer to the end of its useful life, or even over, costs are going to increase. So that needs to be taken into account when you look at your maintenance structure, some of your maintenance plans. Your plans may define older vehicles as maybe the oil's changed every 3,000 instead of every 5,000 miles. You do additional checks. All that should be included in your transit asset management plan. Useful life benchmarks should be revisited periodically to determine if adjustments are necessary. Just like any good plan, sometimes things change. Sometimes you add a new type of service. Sometimes you've got different vehicles that you're now buying from the state or procuring on your own. Constantly revisit the plan, at least annually. Take a look at it and make modifications as necessary. FTA considers useful life benchmark as the age at which a vehicle is expected to reach condition 2.5. So if the scale is 1 to 5, 5 and 4, 5 being the best and 1 being the worst condition, FTA is looking for useful life benchmark at 2.5, so somewhere right in the middle. Next slide. Useful life mileage, another data point that you should take into consideration as you prioritize your vehicle replacement or modification. Taken from inspections, periodic reporting requirements. You can be, and I say inspections, I mean daily inspections by the driver, or quarterly inspections, or oil change inspections. Comparison of useful life mileage to current mileage. Okay, so you want to be able to tell when you're getting close to your useful life mileage or your benchmarks for that vehicle, whether it's age, but in this case, mileage. You may have vehicles that exceed the useful life mileage, but are nowhere close on the years. Especially some of you in rural areas where you may be traveling 30 miles just to pick up one person. You're going to be exceeding your useful life mileage way before your useful life years. A factor to be used in addition to other factors for determining the state of good repair and asset management is replacement and recondition. So you're tracking your mileage knowing that when you get to a certain threshold, consideration for replacement will take place, or even reconditioning, though many rural systems don't do much reconditioning, but some of the larger systems, small urbans, may replace the engine or transmission or do a major overhaul. So useful life mileage can be used in defining performance targets, life cycle costs, and maintenance structure. Must still be able to translate mileage expectations into the age-based useful life benchmark that are required by FTA. So FTA is requiring it in years. So if you develop a mileage scale that basically transforms the mileage into a year-based, with the equivalent, the mileage equivalency is in years, even if it's not actual, but what 200,000 miles translates to in years. Even if it's a 3-year-old vehicle, it could be translate to a 6-year-old vehicle. So again, you do this based on your historic data, your current data, your operating environment. Next slide. And the last is the condition assessment. I kind of spoke about this earlier. Typical state of good repair includes ranks 3, 4, and 5. Description of the ranking is determined by the transit system. Again, FTA wanted to leave the flexibility up to the transit systems to determine this based on environmental conditions, the way you operate the service, and the type of vehicles. A factor to be used in addition to other factors for determining state of good repair and asset management, replacement, and recondition. So again, all of these data points are planning tools. There are also clocks that are ticking that are telling you when you're getting close to having to consider a vehicle to be replaced, or while constantly moving up the priority scale to eventually it's going to be at the top and it'll be the next to be replaced. It can be used in defining performance targets, life cycle costs, and maintenance structure. We mentioned that in the other two as well. Assessments must be conducted on a consistent basis, must be well defined. I spoke of this earlier, especially if you've got more than one individual that's doing the condition assessments. There should be a baseline of how that assessment's done and factors that you look at. You can use the FTA's Transit Economic Requirement Model term in assessing facilities. You do not have to. The FTA made that clear that it does not have to be used when assessing facilities, but you can use it as a guide. Either way, you have to have a 5-point scale, 1 to 5, determining what the state of good repair is on that facility. Next slide. Okay, so more on condition assessment, I'm sorry. Not needed for third-party assets if no direct capital interest. Okay, so if you've got subcontractors that don't have any capital that's operating in public transit, then they won't have to worry about it. Below is just a sample from West Virginia DOT, one of the states that I'm working with on their statewide transit asset management plan. This is what they've used for condition assessment. So it kind of gives you an idea. It's very simple, but it relates to factors that are not ambiguous. You can tell if a vehicle requires frequent minor repairs through evaluation of the maintenance file, looking at repair invoices, talking to mechanics. So you should be able to classify all your vehicles in these description points for 1 through 5. But again, these are all defined by you, the transit system or the state DOT. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about data collection. This is where your starting point. Basically your fleet list, and maybe you're already doing this for your state, for your asset management or for funding purposes, revisiting this on a quarterly basis. But all these factors on the right side of the slide are things that you would need to include that will be needed for your transit asset management plan. Can you put more things on that list? Sure. You can put how the vehicle was funded, 5311 grant, 5339 grant, however you want to place it, but these factors all need to be involved because they're going to help you define your categories. If you see in this list, you see length of vehicle. I did not put weight of vehicle, but length of vehicle, sometimes we'll put it in a different category. So we'll weight a vehicle. Vehicle type, it could be a light transit vehicle, it could be a medium duty transit vehicle, or heavy duty small bus. Those vehicle types need to be defined. What you might do is, in your list, your vehicle type could also parallel your NTD reporting vehicle types. So it's no problem to use that as long as you're familiar with the definition of that vehicle. You know what kind of vehicle that is, whether you use NTD abbreviations for vehicle type or your own. Next slide. Some of the things that you'll need to include in your transit asset management plan. Many of these may be addendums to it. The rolling stock and facility maintenance plan. Most of you should have that, especially if you have FTA interest in your facilities. Just a maintenance plan that shows how often we review our facility and look for electrical continuity, or we look at safety systems, fire extinguishers, smoke alarms. We do tests on our facility. All of that should be in your facility maintenance plans, and then your vehicle maintenance plan. I think you all pretty much have that already in place, but that should just list what the requirements are for maintaining those vehicles and the increments of preventive maintenance. Decision-making tools, I mentioned that in the beginning. That would be something that you all would develop. Some criteria for how you prioritize what vehicles need to be replaced or refurbished. Preventive maintenance programs, inspection details, maintenance costs for life of asset. When developing life cycle costs, you're going to need to know what the maintenance costs are. So if you're using a third party to provide maintenance services, you need to have an idea of how much does it cost to do brakes, how much does it cost to do tires, how much does it cost to do transmission. Any of the major parts of maintenance that your vehicle may need during the course of its life, you should have costs for that, because developing the life cycle costs over the period of that vehicle, you'll need to budget or at least assess what those costs will be for year 1, 2, 3, and 4, or all the way up to 12 if it's a 12-year vehicle. And then the last thing you'll need in your TAM plan is any relevant policies, whether it's procurement, disposition, any policies on inspections that OSHA may do or that the state may do, or any documents that are, again, relevant. Next slide. Performance targets, pretty much something that really FTA is focusing on. They want you all to identify, based on historical data, how you are going to achieve state of good repair and what you will do to improve it. What is your baseline? What do you anticipate next year your goals are? So those are your targets. So if I hope to have, right now my 4-year vehicle fleet age is 5.5 years. Next year I hope to get that down to 5-year average fleet age. So quantifiable targets. Then incorporate other factors like funding, operational change, and then planning. Because if you're going to start a new service or if you're removing a service, it's going to have an impact on your capital assets. So take that into account. You may be cutting back on service and you get rid of all your oldest vehicles. That's going to increase your average life of your vehicle, so you incorporate that into your targets. I put there optional for 2016 and 2017 because some states have received information from FTA. I could be on a slippery slope here, but some states have received information from FTA that the January 1st, 2017 target information was optional. That was until about 3 hours ago when FTA sent out a note reminding folks, states, to get your targets in as of January 1st or 19 days ago. So if you are a state and you've talked with FTA or have had communications with FTA, then you know what the status is on developing targets for the 2016-2017 year. Next slide. And when you develop your performance targets, you just take the same spreadsheet that you had before where you defined your categories and asset classes and subclasses, and then just put your performance targets in for each asset subclass. Now you could have more than one target for each subclass. Just make sure that you follow that same format, and as long as each subclass has a performance target, you'll be in good shape. Next slide. So kind of boiling up or summing up asset management, it's it helps you to prioritize your replacement using planning purposes, using analysis, using historic information to make relative and useful decisions on how you will get your vehicle into a state of good repair. You'll identify when you'll be replacing, when you anticipate replacing assets through the useful life, useful mileage, condition assessment, funding, service planning. All those factors combined together help you to do your prioritization, help you to define your targets, your monitoring. And then the last thing, review of life cycle costs over the life of the vehicle for facility or equipment. These are factors that are going to help you, in more ways than just meeting the compliance of the FTA. It should give you a better snapshot of what your service is looking like. Next slide. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, you'll be required to have a TAM plan by October of 2018. The states, many of whom are already sponsoring for 5311 and some 5307 are doing statewide plans. I mentioned many of the states have done asset inventory programs where they're already collecting this data now. For those states, it should be just an organizational action to organize that into the format for TAM. Next slide. So finally, the benefits of transit asset management, besides adding a little bit more work to your everyday, putting out fires and providing safe and reliable public transportation services. This is going to make you take a look at your data. It's going to give you a better snapshot of where your system is. All of you as transit managers and state DOTs want to have the very best service that you can out on the street for your passengers, but also for your employees. Safety is key. Safety is going to be coming into play very soon, and the requirements are going to come with that. So this is just another tool to help you provide safer transportation service and more reliable. If you can identify issues before they actually happen out on the road, the better. This can reduce your maintenance costs. This can reduce your tow bill. Hey, great. TAM plans will provide FTA with a nationwide state of good repair to help with infrastructure investments in the future. And that is something that I think the next administration is going to be looking at. So by this rule being in place, it will give FTA a better idea of what their recipients' needs are for infrastructure. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. We do have a couple of questions. Kelly, what I'm going to do is send you one via chat just so that you can read it. My reading it may make it a little bit more confusing. And then for those of you who have questions, you can just go into the dashboard, type in your question, and what we'll do is send them to Kelly and get some answers. Do you have that first question?
I do, and
okay.
I will attempt to read it and answer it. For analytical process, do we need a mathematical formula-based tool or a narrative describing useful life? If mathematical formulas are required, does anybody have a sample? Honestly, you don't need to have a big formula to identify, to come up with useful life. What I've done in some cases is as simple as a 4-year vehicle divided by 5 actual years equals 0.8. Oh, wait. A 4-year vehicle. Sorry. Okay. So a 4-year vehicle that's 5 years old is at 125% of its useful life. That's and I do that for all of my vehicles. If you have a vehicle, your vehicle fleet list, you can do that for all your vehicles and see. And then when you develop thresholds, like 5 ranked vehicle is 0.75 to 1. A 4 ranked vehicle is 1.25 to 1. So then apply your thresholds for each of your 1 through 5 ranking, and you can define where your state of good repair is. But it's up to you to come up with those thresholds. But what I'd do first is just, if you know the useful life of your vehicle based on whether you use the circular formula or not, and what the actual life out years are for your vehicle, then just divide the two and you can get a snapshot of where you are. So I hope that, so it doesn't need to be complicated, but you can make it complicated if you have several different factors that you want to involve in your decision-making process.
Okay, Kelly, I have, hold on. I can't seem to get this thing, copy, sending out, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to send it out now. And the question is, do maintenance costs for life of asset include all maintenance, preventive, and corrective?
Yes.
Okay, that was good.
And simple, yeah. So ideally, when you're developing your life cycle costs, you want to know how much an A inspection costs, B inspection, C inspection, and also the time frame that they're done. If an A inspection is done every 5,000 miles, B inspection is done every 12,000 miles. So then, based on historic information of that vehicle, how many miles we put on it last year, what inspections would I be doing this year? I'd be doing an A, a B, an A, a C, you know, and then if you've got a cost for each of those types of inspection, you can come up with your preventive maintenance costs, and then any anticipated costs, like, you know, year 3, based on my mileage, I'm going to have to replace all my brakes, and the cost to do that is this. Year 2, I'm going to have to replace all my tires, and here's the anticipated cost for that. Things you can account for are accidents.
Okay, I just sent you another one having to do whether MPOs have to do a transit access management plan.
Actually, yes, and bear with me. I'm getting ready to quote a dear colleague letter that came out January 18th, 2017. I'm sending this letter to, this is from FTA. I'm sending this letter to remind you of upcoming timeframes to meet requirements of the Transit Asset Management Final Rule that became effective. Okay, blah, blah. And the Metropolitan and Statewide Non-Metropolitan Transit Planning Final Rule that became effective 27th. So the planning rule requires each MPO to establish targets not later than 180 days after the date of which the relevant state. Yeah. So yes, MPOs are included.
Okay, Kelly.
And that came from FTA yesterday.
Here's another question I sent.
I don't, oh, sorry. The new NTD form does not allow us to use subclass, only asset class. So I'm assuming you're talking about the A90 form does not allow a subclass. In that case, if that's what FTA is looking for you to use, then you can only do performance measures on the asset class and no subclass. What I would recommend, though, is under the performance measures or the targets, you can make targets that are associated with the subclasses. So If you just have rolling stock, and you say, well, our buses, we're going to try to get our average useful life down from 14 years down to 13 years in 2018, and then work your way down through the subclasses.
Okay. Next question, having to do with the FTA manual for assessing the condition of facilities, is very extensive and would be expensive to implement for small 5311. If you want to comment on that, or we could just forward that to the FTA.
Yeah, and my comment on that would be that FTA does not require you to use the term, the process which they've developed for assessing facilities, but you need to come up with some kind of a replacement that touches upon a lot of the factors that are in term. FTA has stressed that it is scalable, and they've got to recognize that 5311 recipients have less manpower to do a lot of these compliance things. So I would touch base with either your state DOT or even your FTA regional office and just kind of get a feel for how they want you to structure it. But you can also use the term as a guideline, but there has to be some method of determining the condition of the facility.
Okay. This next question has to do with just if you could give more clarification on the targets, the performance targets.
Sure. Performance targets, and it depends on what kind of system you are. If you're a state DOT, you'll have different performance targets than maybe a rural transit system. But targets can be, I talked about how many breakdowns we had per 100,000 miles. You know, we had, last year we had, 100,000 miles. Last year we had 3 breakdowns for every 100,000 miles. Next year, our goal, our target, is to knock that down to 2 breakdowns per 100,000 miles. Or another example might be our average 4-year vehicle is average age is 5.5 years. Our target for next year is to reduce the average age of our 4-year vehicles to 4.85 years. So it's, and when it's quantifiable, that means you're putting numbers associated to it as opposed to an ambiguous statement that, well, we're going to try to make our useful life lower. It needs to be quantifiable, which means you need to know what you have now and what your goal is for next year. Those are what the targets are. So targets are basically goals.
Okay. On this one, has to do with whether that fuel may be incorporated in determining the useful life of a vehicle.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. I think most of us know that diesel vehicles tend to have a longer life than gas vehicles, depending on the way they're used. But yes, you can add fuel type. You can set up a separate category for diesel vehicles or different thresholds for diesel vehicles, and I'm assuming that's where the person's going with that. The diesel vehicles go a lot longer than gas.
Yeah. We do have a question that just came in having to do with the MPO question, that they're just not quite understanding that. You can make it clearer. If not, you know, we can send an explanation out to the person that's asking that question.
Yeah, I think in this case, I would rather do a little more background on the MPO aspect, okay, just so that we can give them a concise answer, whether that's going through FTA or what. But I would prefer to do that if that's possible.
Yes. What we'll do is in answer to the questions that we weren't able to answer during this webinar, we'll send out an explanation or an answer to the question after some research. Okay, I have another one coming through. Kelly, if a Tier 2 provider leases a vehicle from another Tier 2 provider, who's responsible to track the asset?
It should be the initial Tier 2 provider that actually owns the vehicle or is the subrecipient from the state. I don't know what the situation is, but it would be up to the original Tier 2 provider to ensure that tracking is done by the person leasing the vehicle. But ultimately, it comes to the owner of the vehicle has to be responsible for making sure that the data is included and that it's accurate. So, you know, in that case, I would require the person leasing the vehicle to track all this information. But it's ultimately the first Tier 2 person is responsible.
Okay, for Tier 2 5311 subrecipient, do we have to include non-FTA funded assets in the TAM?
If those assets are being used in public transit, and honestly, sorry, I was just looking to see if I could quote the federal guidelines here. So, final rule only applies to recipients and subrecipients of Chapter 53 funds who own, operate, or manage public transportation capital assets used in the provision of public transportation. Honestly, I'm questioning myself on that, on whether vehicles not without FTA interest. I think I want to respond later to that, but my initial response is if it's in public transportation, it has to be accounted for. But I'd like to get back to the person on that.
Okay. And I mean, we're coming up to an hour and 45 minutes, so what I'm going to do is just send one more question to you, and then any other questions that we weren't able to answer, we'll get answers for you and email you the answer. And that includes everybody that's on the call. The final question, what are the requirements of individual transit systems if the state DOT develops a group TAM?
Well, that's going to be defined by the state DOT, but I'd be willing to bet that the requirements will be that each transit system will have to provide that spreadsheet on their fleet. Each transit system will have to provide the conditional assessment guides that they use to determine the condition of their vehicles, or the state may come up with a conditional guide that they give out to all their grant recipients to use. The transit provider would also need to have an understanding of what their costs are, because each transit system is going to pay different amounts for their maintenance program, have different A inspections. So many of the things that I listed you would be responsible for, but the state plan may develop a lot of those tools and give them to the transit providers as part of the transit asset management plan. But for the most part, that's kind of what the state will decide that. But to keep consistency across the board, I would imagine a lot of tools will be developed by the state to be shared among all the 5311 or Tier 2 providers.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelly. I appreciate you doing this presentation. It was very informative and extremely timely. And I apologize for, and I knew I was going to mess up your name because, of course, when there's more people listening, you're going to do that. Just for everybody, go ahead. I'm sorry, Kelly.
No, I was just going, it's fine, no problem.
Okay. The presentation that you saw will be available on the National RTAP website, nationalrtap.org/webinars or /webinars, and the recording of this webinar will be available in about a week. One thing we want to remind everybody that's still here is that National RTAP will be providing a technical assistance conference on October 29th through November 1st, and that will be in Omaha, Nebraska. If you've attended any of our conferences, we've had a couple, I think for those that have attended, realize that we really get down to the nitty-gritty, the facts, more operational and compliance related, you know, kind of the 101 of everything having to do with transit. And we hope that you'll at least go visit our website to see the activities that will be occurring at the conference and hopefully register, and that we'll see you in October. I want to thank everybody for joining this webinar and wish you a happy day. Goodbye.